Hey everybody, what's going on? This is the professor just coming to you live. I want to talk a little bit about the neuron and get into a bit of neuron physiology. I don't care what anybody says. This chapter, for most people who are taking anatomy and physiology, turns out to be one of two ways. You either understand it or you don't. So what I want to do today is I kind of want to debunk the myths around how a neuron creates an action potential and talk a little bit about some of the terminology that you wind up seeing and kind of use a little bit of our McGraw-Hill notes, kind of walk you through some visuals and kind of put some things into perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to change the screen setting here. And hopefully all of this will work out just fine. And give me just a moment because it's looking like I've got some things changed on my screen. There we go. And so now I want to bring up the slideshow. And you should be seeing the slideshow right now. This should be what's on your screen. It should be changing to the actual slides. So let me start by saying this. This video is assuming that you have read some of whatever your instructor has been going over with you. This video is assuming that you have attempted to read any of it. This video is assuming that this is not your first time ever looking at a neuron. So please keep that in mind while I'm covering over this material. Now, with that being said, before you talk about an action potential and how an action potential is generated in a neuron, something that you need to understand is you need to understand the anatomy of a neuron. So in this image, we can see the cell body of the neuron, we can see the dendrites, we can see the axon hillock, and we can see the axon itself, and then we can see the extensions on the very end of the axon, ending with synaptic bulbs. Now, these areas are not highlighted and labeled just for entertainment's sake, but these things are very important because the area of the neuron where it's going to receive incoming information is going to be on its dendrites and also along the surface of the cell body. The place where we're going to have the graded potential, where the graded potential is what leads up to an actual action potential, is on the axon hillock. The actual action potential is going to travel down the axon and is going to terminate at the synaptic bulb or the synaptic knob, where we will then transmit neurotransmitters to the postsynaptic cell. So with all that being said, let's go back up here to the top. If you've been looking over this, you've been reviewing over it, and you say, I still don't understand how an action potential is being generated, one of the first things you need to pay close attention to are the type of channels that are labeled in this picture. I cannot stress how important it is to understand the channels that are in these pictures, because if you don't know why the channels are where they are and what the channels themselves are and what passes through the channels and how you activate the channels, then it's going to make understanding an action potential formation on a neuron just that much more difficult. So basically what we're seeing is one neuron in this picture, but you got to remember that in reality there's a presynaptic neuron. There's another neuron in this photo. He's not in this picture, but there's another neuron in reality who is talking to the neuron that you see on your screen. And then there's a third neuron who is being spoken to by the neuron that's currently on the screen right now. So really, there should be three neurons in this picture. We are only seeing one, and he is in the middle. There should be a neuron talking to the one on the screen, and there should be a neuron that the one on the screen is talking to. So there really should be three neurons in the picture to get the full effect. So there's a neuron off screen who's talking to the neuron that's currently on screen, and when the neuron is talking to another neuron, we call that neuron who's doing the talking a presynaptic neuron. Pre meaning before, synaptic referring to the synapse. So there's a neuron before the synapse that's talking to this neuron that's on the screen. That presynaptic neuron would then make the neuron in this picture a postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron that's not in this picture, he is releasing neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters are chemicals that are released across the synaptic cleft, and then they bind to specific receptor sites on the surface of the dendrite in the cell body. And when these chemicals bind to the receptor sites, they cause certain channels to open. That's why all three of the channels that are labeled there on the receptive segment, notice he's called receptive because he receives neurotransmitters. Notice that the channels here are all channels that are chemically gated. In other words, those gates open due to a chemical. That's why they're called chemically gated cation channels, or chemically gated potassium channels, or chemically gated chloride channels. That is there because these gates are going to open because of some type of chemical, and in this case, it's a neurotransmitter such as acetylcholine or dopamine or GABA. You know, these are chemicals that are released by the presynaptic neuron, and they bind to these receptor sites on these chemically gated channels. And then the chemically gated channels open in the presence of these chemicals. Well, once they open, they cause positive ions to flood in. The inside of the cell becomes positive, and that positive area begins to spread. All right, the positiveness in that area begins to spread up to the axon hillock, and the axon hillock, that area is known as the initial segment, because basically if we don't make it happen at the initial segment, it's not going to happen anywhere else. So basically at the initial segment, this is where the positive charge that's been spread from the dendrites in the cell body begin to create a bit of a higher voltage or higher measure of voltage in this area. That higher measure of voltage then stimulates the voltage gated sodium channels and the voltage gated potassium channels to activate. This is very important because this is the initial segment, and if we don't get this segment to go extremely positive extremely quickly, then we will not be able to open the channels on the conductive segment and generate an action potential. So the initial segment at the axon hillock, those channels open. And when they open, enough positive ions come in to get the voltage high enough to activate the voltage gated channels on the conductive segment. And once we get enough charge created, we can now open the voltage gated channels on the conductive segment. An action potential is formed, and the channels all along the axon continue to open in the presence of this higher voltage that we have ultimately created. And once that voltage, that electrical current called an action potential, travels all the way down the axon, it then terminates at the synaptic bulbs, also known as synaptic knobs. And it's there that that voltage, that action potential, that electrical current stimulates the voltage gated calcium channels. Calcium comes into the cell, and then it causes the synaptic bulbs or synaptic knobs to then release neurotransmitters, and then those neurotransmitters then come into contact with another cell, which then turns this cell from a postsynaptic cell into a presynaptic cell, and the third neuron that you can't see in the picture then becomes the postsynaptic cell. Now, if you had trouble following what I just said, that is perfectly understandable because I was talking really fast. But what you need to do is you need to rewind the video again and listen to what I'm talking about and just follow it. Follow it and listen to the explanation and continue to follow the slide and rewind it and listen to it as many times as you want, because it's going to click once you begin to see what I'm saying. Now, with that being said, I got to move on. I got to keep it going. I got to stay in this vein. And I'm going to skip forward to about slide 40 in the notes. And I'll know what I'm looking for when I see it. What I want to talk about now is I want to get into the resting membrane potential. And when you get into the resting membrane potential, what you'll notice is that it says in the notes that the membrane potential in a resting excitable cell is what we call the RMP, the resting membrane potential. Relative is the relative difference in charge across a membrane, measured with a voltmeter. It's got a negative value, typically negative 70 millivolts. More positive ions exist outside of the neuron than what's in it when it is at resting membrane. When it's at rest, excuse me. A consequence of the plasma membrane permeability to ions. Now, what is that saying? Basically, when the neuron is doing nothing, when we don't have ions going back and forth, that's when we say that the membrane is at rest. It's a resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential is the measure of charge on the neuron cell membrane when we don't have a whole lot of ions going in and out of the cell. That's what that is. So basically, are there ions going in and out of the cell? Yes, very little. They're passing through what we call leak channels or leak gates. But that's such a minimal amount of ions going in and out that it's not enough to adjust the resting membrane potential. And the resting membrane potential actually has a numerical charge. It's negative 70. So at negative 70 millivolts, we can honestly say that the neuron is at resting membrane potential and there's nothing going on. You are not creating an action potential. There's not little electrical current ripples going across the cell membrane. Nothing is happening. And we want everything to begin with a resting membrane potential. We want the action potential to begin. We want the process of an action potential to actually begin with resting membrane potential. Now, I kind of want to go to this image because I could talk about the other stuff that I just skipped, but that's not going to do you any good. What I want to show you is I want to show you resting membrane potential in a visual. Right now, we're seeing this is assuming, the resting membrane potential is assuming that there's no action potential being created right now. And if you look at this little picture at the top where it says negative 70 millivolts, you'll notice that there's a bunch of pluses on the outside, but there's a bunch of negatives on the inside. And what it's trying to tell you is it's trying to tell you that there are a ton of positive ions on the outside of the neuron, but there are a ton of negative ions on the inside of the neuron. And that's important to grasp because what that's saying is in order to keep resting membrane potential, those positives need to stay outside and those negatives need to stay on the inside. And because there's no transfer, there's nothing crossing back and forth, that's why it's staying at resting membrane potential. Nobody's moving. No one's crossing the line. Think of the cell membrane on a neuron as a demilitarized zone. And as long as the positives stay on one side and the negatives stay on the other side, we don't have to worry about anything changing. If you look at the picture down at the bottom, it puts it into even greater perspective by showing you, look, here's a sodium leak channel, here's a potassium leak channel, and here's a sodium-potassium pump. Now, you'll notice that at resting membrane potential, you got leak channels. And guess what? These little purple dudes right here, sodium, positive ions, they're slowly coming in. But look at how many are coming in. One. And look at the potassium leak channel. The potassium leak channel, these little potassium ions are passing through, and it's only like one. All right. So basically, what we're seeing here is we're seeing these positive ions, which are potassium, but look at what direction the positive ions are going. The positive ions, all these big potassium ions, they're all going out. All these big potassium ions are all going out. They're going out of the cell. You barely see any sodium coming in. You just got this one. So it's keeping it pretty negative inside of the cell, therefore maintaining resting potential, resting membrane potential, I should say. Now, with that being said, let's move on to the next phase. So I'm at resting membrane potential, then I go to graded potential, which we haven't really talked about yet. Graded potential is nothing more than it's an in-between stage. Graded potential is an in-between stage between resting potential and an action potential. Graded potential does not last very long at all. It's amazing that we even realized that there was a graded potential due to the fact that the thing happened so quickly. So you got the resting membrane potential, then some type of neurotransmitter opens all those other channels that we didn't see. They open up, they allow things like sodium ions to come flooding into the neuron, which starts to make it slightly more positive. But all those other channels are still active, they're still doing their own thing. So we get just a little more positive, and that little bit more positive is called graded potential. But that graded potential begins to spread all the way across to the axon hillock, which connects to the axon. And when that positive current comes into contact with the voltage gated channels on the axon, all of the voltage gated channels on the axons that come into contact with the spread of positive ions begin to open. And as you can tell, the axon is long, and so the channels open in one direction all the way down the length of the axon, which then of course leads to an action potential. Now, that process of going from graded potential to action potential is what we call depolarization. Now, you know, when we say depolarize, to de-stress, to deregulate, you know, when you de something, you're taking something, you're reversing something, you know, you're setting something in place. That you're going against the grain. So when we do depolarization, what we're doing is we're swapping, because in resting membrane potential, the inside of the cell was extremely negative, the outside of the cell was very positive. In depolarization, what we're doing is we're making the inside of the cell more positive, because we're changing how many negatives are inside the cell. So this could be from pumping more positive ions into the cell, or pumping more negative ions out of the cell. Either way, we're trying to make the inside of the cell more positive, and that is depolarization. That's why when you hear the term repolarization, that RE means to reset, to put back. So when we repolarize, we're trying to bring the cell back to the way things were. But to depolarize is like to destabilize, you know, to take out of the position that you were once in. Repolarize means to return you back to the state that you were once in. And so it says here in the slide that depolarization happens inside of cells, and that's when the inside of the cell becomes more positive than the resting membrane potential. So resting membrane potential is a -70. So in this case, depolarization is trying to get the cell up to -60. Now, if you're looking at that and you're saying -70 is lower than -60, how is that even possible? And you kind of have to look at the number line, and when you see the number line, you'll notice that as you go down the number line, the numbers seem to get bigger, regardless of the negative sign. But the numbers tend to get bigger as far as what we can tell. But because they have a negative sign in front of them, what's really happening is the numbers are getting smaller as we're going down that number line. So when we depolarize the cell becomes more positive on the inside, therefore leading it to depolarize, going from -70 to -60. And this happens when the gated channels are now open. And in this case, these are voltage gated channels, which are allowing more positive ions such as sodium into the neuron. And so this, you know, it becomes more positive. Now, hyperpolarization is when the cell becomes more negative. This process, hyperpolarization, happens after you created an action potential. So what winds up happening is we start off at resting potential, which is -70 millivolts. Then some presynaptic cell releases neurotransmitters to bind to the um, receptor sites on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron, which therefore opens chemically gated channels. And they open because they are chemically gated channels and they respond to a chemical, which in this case happens to be a neurotransmitter. So they open because of the neurotransmitter. They start letting some sodium in, but it's not enough of those channels. There's not enough neurotransmitter. There's not enough of these channels to create an action potential all by themselves. So they only allow enough sodium ions into the cell to create a localized stimulation, a localized stimulus. So they create what we call a localized change. So the local area where the chemical drop becomes more positive. But that's only in that localized area. But those localized areas spread, they interconnect, they continue to spread, and then they get to the the axon hillock, where at the axon hillock, that charge, that increased charge, now opens voltage gated channels, which are located on the axon hillock, which then increases the amount of sodium ions coming in, making things a bit more positive, raising it from negative 60 to negative 55. And then once you hit that, that spreads a charge that's high enough to stimulate the voltage gated channels right there at the beginning of the axon. And then those voltage gated channels open up, and there's a ton of those on the axon. So when they open up, they allow a lot of positive sodium ions to flood into the axon, therefore drastically increasing the measure of transmembrane potential, therefore raising the number from a negative 55 millivolts all the way to a positive 30 millivolts. But once it becomes a positive 30, that positive voltage is actually a signal to all those voltage gated channels to close. And so once those voltage gated channels open and let all of that positive sodium in, and then you make an action potential, the neuron says, okay, that's it, we got what we wanted. And all those voltage gated channels that open because of the previous voltages, they now close in the presence of a positive 30 millivolts. And because they close, the neuron, the inside of the neuron goes drastically negative. And that's what we're seeing with hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization is when the action potential has been created, and now that positive 30 has a feedback mechanism on it, that positive 30 stimulates all the other channels, sodium channels, to now close. And so it's no longer getting more positive in there, it's now drastically getting more negative. And that's where you see on the screen where it says it's going from negative 70 all the way to negative 80. In some books it says it gets all the way to negative 90. And this happens because of opening the this happens because we closed those sodium ion channels and we opened the voltage gated potassium channels. And see, potassium is positive, but it's a real big ion. So when positive potassium ions go leaving out of the cell, that's the difference between a $1 bill and a $20 bill. See, the sodium is like a $1 bill, but the potassium is like a $20 bill. So, you may have $1 coming in every so often, but those $20 coming out every so often is making a much bigger dent, therefore creating a debt. So we just finished talking about this. And so let me go back for a second. There's that resting membrane potential again. This is what I just finished talking to you about, where I said, when it's at rest, there's nothing happening. No one's going in and out. The ions are staying exactly where they're supposed to stay. So positive on the outside, negative on the inside. Notice that these gated channels are actually closed, all three of them. Why? Because there's no stimulus to make them open. And then you bring in the fact that we can now change the resting membrane potential by causing depolarization. At some point in time, neurotransmitters were released from a presynaptic neuron. The neurotransmitters landed on the dendrites in the cell body of this postsynaptic neuron, therefore leading to a greater potential, and therefore leading to an action potential on the axon. And the way all of that happened was the stimulus caused all three of these channels. Well, the stimulus actually caused this channel to open, which this has to be a gated sodium channel, probably a voltage gated channel, which allows lots of positive sodium to flood into the cell. Then we see hyperpolarization. This is how the cell resets itself. It says, okay, I did all that to get an action potential. I got what I wanted. So now I need to reset myself. I need to recock the gun. I need to, pull back on the string. I need to get myself set up so that I can do this all over again. And the only way to get everything straight so that I can do it, what I just did all over again, is make myself more negative again. And you can see here where it has a negative 80. And it says, okay, we're going to make the inside more negative in here because we're done, and so that's why it wants to do what it wants to do. Neuron is concerned with getting that negative charge back in operation inside the cell. And we talked about a graded potential. I mentioned to you that it was a local current. It had a local effect. These are called local potentials, graded potentials, because notice that they occur in the receptive segment of the neuron. So they occurs there in that upper cell body and dendrite area. Is due to the opening of chemically gated channels, which remember that chemically gated channels open because of a chemical. In this case, that chemical is the neurotransmitter that was released by the presynaptic cell, the one you couldn't see in the photo. Temporarily allows passage of small amounts of a specific ion, and the local current established has ions moving parallel to the plasma membrane, experiences resistance from contents of cytosol, and eventually becomes weaker and ceases. Okay. Let's see. There's one other place I want to go with this, and I want to make sure that I'm getting there. If there's somewhere I want to take you, I want to talk very briefly about the action potential itself. There's not a lot to say about the action potential itself, to be completely honest with you. All of the real action is before and after an action potential, to be honest. The action potential itself is so quick, and it's traveling, it's moving, and it's such a quick and simple process that there's really not much to talk about. I mean, an action potential, it starts within the initial segment. It starts with what's happening there in the axon hillock. It's propagated along the axon. In other words, it is supported in its process along the axon, and due to opening a voltage gated channel. So you can make an action potential if you can get the voltage gated channels on the axon to open, and that's the whole purpose of having a graded potential. The graded potential slowly and gradually gets the local area just positive enough so that you can stimulate the voltage gated channels on the axon, which are very numerous, and they will allow tons of sodium positive ions into the cell, therefore allowing the cell to generate an action potential. I missed one of the most important things. Threshold value. Threshold value is the minimum voltage change to open the voltage gated channel. Any value below this is a sub-threshold value. So we want to meet threshold. As long as we meet threshold, we can get a voltage gated channel to open. Now, in the case of the axon hillock, all you really need is you just need to get up to like 60, and that's all that happens. That's how it works when you get to the axon hillock. But when you get to the axon itself, you've got to hit threshold. That is the bare minimum level, or the bare minimum measure of positive ions that you can have in order to open voltage gated channels to create an action potential. So if you notice, if a threshold value is reached, in other words, if we create a high enough millivoltage from that graded potential to stimulate the voltage gated channels so that they'll open on the axon and let the sodium flood in, if that happens, then what we really say is we say that threshold value was reached, the sodium channels open, the membrane potential reversed, because remember, inside that membrane potential was really negative until we let all that positive ion stuff flood in, and now the membrane potential is going to be reversed. It's going to go from really negative to really positive, and sodium enters into the neuron and it makes the inside relatively positive, and then there's a flow of local current to the adjacent areas. Here's something that's very key to understand. Action potentials involve temporary reversal of polarity across the plasma membrane because the inside becomes relatively positive, followed by a return to resting membrane potential. What are they saying? What they're saying is that when you create an action potential, what you're doing is you're changing the polarity of that cell membrane due to the fact that you're taking what's positive and sticking it inside of the cell where things are normally negative. So what winds up happening is when we start swapping ions like that, we can actually create a electrical charge. That's why we measure action potential by millivoltage. Action potentials are self-propagated. They maintain the intensity as they move to the synaptic knob. So you can't sit there and say, oh, well, this action potential ain't going to cut it. No. The action potential is actually self-propagated. And once you release the stimulus on that postsynaptic neuron, that postsynaptic neuron is going to do everything in its power to stay within normal range and wind up producing an action potential. And you have to understand that there is a law that you got to follow in the midst of all this. It is known as the all or none law, which the all or none law states that if threshold is reached, the action potential can be sent. Plain and simple. You don't meet the threshold, you don't get an action potential. So what it's telling you is that, okay, resting potential is at -70. When we start letting some sodium ions in, we barely got that thing up to -60. Well, once we get it to somewhere between -60 and -55, that is the voltage amount required to open up the other voltage gated channels all along the length of the axon, which allows tons of sodium ions to flood in, therefore making everything positive. And that's all because we reach threshold. But if you have a person like Parkinson's, if you have a person who's like someone who has Parkinson's, their brain cells are not releasing enough of a particular neurotransmitter in order to give them control and to be able to give them the necessary stabilization that they once had. So that neurotransmitter is very little to no concentration of that neurotransmitter being released. Therefore, the localized signal is very weak. Therefore, threshold might not be reached. And if it's not reached, then that signal never really makes it to the muscle where you wind up just having the person practically not being able to move, or not being able to be controlled. Well, I think that's all that I'm actually going to get into. I don't want to go any further because what happens after this, and I'm going to bring the screen back up. What actually happens in the midst of all of this, and what actually happens in the midst of all of this is that once you create an action potential, the action potential travels down the axon and then it gets to the synaptic knob. And when it gets to the synaptic knob, that's when the voltage, that action potential, creates the action potential creates just enough of a measurement to stimulate the voltage-gated channels on the synaptic synaptic knob, and then it releases the neurotransmitter. And that's where we're going to stop right now, and then we'll pick up on the next video to talk about what happens at a synapse itself. Talk to you later. Peace.